Doing good? Happy to hear it. Everything's good. Good morning again, Life Point Crossing. My name is Ross. I am happy to be here. I'm glad you're here if you're joining us in person or if you're watching online, however you've chosen to be a part of this today. Has anybody else seen the ESPN 30 for 30 documentary called Broke? It's about ex-pro athletes going bankrupt. It's really, really fascinating. I watched it at least, I think I may have seen it 3 times. I know I've seen it at least twice. It's so good, my son's high school showed it to them because it was so helpful in so many ways, really. And, you know, we talk sometimes just sort of as people or as a culture or whatever about like how absurdly much money pro athletes make. For a lot of those guys, it's more than a year than most of us will make in a lifetime. And so we think about that and we talk about like what would you even do with all that money? We have legitimately no idea. Like, I wouldn't even know how to spend it. But apparently for some of these guys, it's not that much of a problem, right? They're very, very talented both at playing sports ball and spending money, because I found some statistics that said, it said that 78% of NFL players and 60% of NBA players are bankrupt within 5 years of retirement. That's absolutely amazing, isn't it? If you've not heard that before, that's shocking. It's part of why the documentary was so interesting. And it's not like just guys who only had like 2-year careers. Sometimes it's really successful guys that had long careers and made incredible amounts of money. There was an NBA player named Kenny Anderson. If you watched, you remember his name. He was a good player for a lot of years. He made $63 million. He didn't file for bankruptcy 5 years after he retired. He filed bankruptcy the day after he retired and took a job as a school teacher, hopefully not economics. I don't know the details on that. Hopefully it was gym. I think that would have been more, like that's what I would have hired for. But that's true. Even growing up in the Midwest, I was always a Boston Celtics fan. We had an all-star for a lot of years. His name was Antoine Walker. He made $108 million. 2 years after he retired, he filed for bankruptcy. He owed $8 million. How do you get $8 million in debt? What kind of day is that? Like, I hope none of us ever have that day when we roll out of bed and check our bank statement and like, oh snap, like I knew things weren't good, but I owe $8 million. That's a rough morning. You all remember Mike Tieszen. When he was fighting, he made somewhere around $400 million. And when he filed for bankruptcy, he owed $23 million. So it's pretty unthinkable for most of us, either making or spending $400 million. But if we could look on their situation with a little bit of perspective, which is really part of what the documentary did very helpfully, right? And see, like, what leads to this? Like, what kind of mistakes do you make? And it takes a lot of mistakes to overspend $400 million, I think. But like, what kind of habits and activities end up, creating this kind of just crazy situation? And really, the documentary went through a bunch of sort of different categories, but I think they fit very well into 2 large groups. They're number 1, they made stupid investments, and number 2, they just didn't think enough about the future. Okay, so it wasn't that they didn't make investments. They invested. And it wasn't like, sometimes like every investment carries risk. Sometimes they work out, sometimes they don't. But no, they were like categorically stupid investments. A lot of it was just listening to friends who had no idea what they were talking about. Some of it was listening to friends who were never looking out for them in the first place. Other things were they would be interested in doing things like opening restaurants, which is not a bad idea necessarily, but it's a really competitive industry. If you don't know what you're doing, you're going to sink in an enormous amount of cash and get nothing for it. They also, a lot of investments like in real estate, which again, can be a great way to invest if you have a solid plan and you have something set up where you're going to make, 7 or 8 or 10% interest for the foreseeable future. But the way this presents, it said, like to a 25-year-old multi-million-dollar athlete, that's just not really very exciting. Like, there's not a lot of sizzle with that steak. And like, here we're going to help you make your $10 million into $11 million. So instead, they would be attracted to the deals where, look, if things go right, we can make your $10 million into $20 million. And that sounds a lot more exciting, but of course, with that greater potential reward comes a lot greater risk. And so now sometimes you have real problems. So just very, very foolish investments was number one. The other was just not thinking enough about their future and the reality that it is possible to run out of money. It's very easy to imagine how you would sign a $20 million contract and you think, okay, I am set for life. And you should be. But how easy would it be for set for life to then translate in your mind into, okay, now money doesn't matter and I can never possibly run out, which turns out to be not true. And so, over a few years, you gamble away a couple $1 million. Right? Maybe you end up coming into 3 or 4 or 6 or 8 child support payments. It was actually one of the interesting things. It said there's this whole industry that's set up where you can sign up and pay to be notified when a professional athlete is at a club near you. And of course, because child support payments are based on the percentage of the income of the father, if you can put on a pregnant from a professional athlete, baby mama just got wealthy. And so guys fall into this like a lot. And so you end up creating numerous child support payments. And of course, those keep going after you retire. Like they don't stop when your checks stop. And then, maybe if you travel with an entourage and there are these people who you pay for everything everywhere you go, after a while it adds up. And I guess you end up $8 million in debt. It's still tough for those numbers to make sense, I know, because they're just like kind of crazy. I barely even know half of you, and really I can only see Eric and Tiffany in the front row. Anyway, so maybe our whole back row is full of ex-pro athletes who are doing very, very well and have invested well. But my suspicion is that most of us here today have managed to scrape by on far, far less than these people, right? So, yes, that sounds like that's a yes. I'll take that as a yes. And so it seems to us to be just the absolute height of moronic that people would waste like tens of millions of dollars. Like if that was us, like if that was you would not make those same kinds of mistakes. Like you would make solid, long-term investments so that your money would be there when you needed it. And you would be always thinking about the future. Like you would be saving. I mean, you'd spend some. You'd buy a couple. There's a couple things, right? I'd buy a couple things. But we'd save even more and always be aware that the future is going to go for maybe a long time, right? So you would not make those stupid mistakes, not if it was you. Well, guess what? I don't think that God looks at our money the same way we look at Mike Tyson. Like, I don't think God looks down from heaven and thinks, like, I have no idea how they're able to plow through that, whatever annual income is. I don't think it's quite like that. But you do wonder, like, how does our money look to God? It's actually a good question, isn't it? And we've been saying in this whole series, right, like it's going to look different. It's going to look probably very different. If there's anything you remember after this series is done, I hope it's these verses from Isaiah 55 where it says that the way God sees, look, his ways and his thoughts are so different from ours, so much higher, like the heavens are above the earth. So it's going to look different to God and probably a lot different. And of course, since it's God, it's going to be better. Like certainly he's going to understand better and have a better perspective. And so when we think about this, I end up fearing that God maybe does see us making the exact same 2 mistakes that we saw in this documentary. That we make kind of foolish investments and that we don't think enough about the real long-term future. So the good news is that the Bible has bucket loads to say about money and the way we handle our money. And so we're going to start with Jesus, as we often do, in Matthew. And here's what he says. He says, don't store up treasures here on earth. Oh, just about stop right there, right? Oh, he says, don't store up treasures here on earth. Because that's exactly, precisely what we do. And what we try to do is we do like exactly what Jesus says don't. right? It ends up making up a huge part of our lives, whether we even really want to admit it or think about it like that. It's really kind of true, isn't it? You can almost stop right there, except, I don't know, like maybe, like sometimes Jesus, puts twists in, or sometimes, you'll hear someone say, well, okay, so he says this, but really, I think, what he means is kind of the opposite. And Ross, there's the ... So you cut him off. What are you hiding? What's he really saying? Maybe is this going to turn around for us a little bit? So he says, well, don't store up treasures here on earth, okay, where moths eat them and rust destroys them. All right, well, I mean, those do happen. And where thieves break in and steal. I suppose I've seen that too. These are actually pretty decent points that he's making, really. It kind of has some pretty helpful perspective. Like when you say it that way, you kind of have to confess that, yeah, Jesus might have some idea what he's talking about. This maybe really is a pretty solid point. And he's kind of giving us a little bit of earthly wealth through God goggles here, right? And saying, you know what, your earthly treasures, they're really very, very poor short-term investments. Just as an example, probably the second biggest purchase you'll make after a home, or if you never do purchase a home, probably the biggest purchase you'll make is a car. And I remember watching game shows sometimes when I was growing up in South Dakota in the 80s, and I had very, very strictly regulated TV watching abilities. We didn't get many channels, and most everything else was off limits. So sometimes I watched game shows. And what was the greatest thing that you could win in a game show in the 80s? Yeah, a new car! Dun-dun-dun. That's exactly the thing. Of course, we all know, like, how amazing would that be? And who hasn't fantasized? I could tell just from that, right? We've all probably fantasized about going on a game show, winning something amazing that changes your life, and there was nothing more amazing that you could win in a game show in the 80s than a new car. Just the chance, just the opportunity to play for one. People would be shouting and dancing and jumping around. And like, I don't know about you, but I always liked the sporty ones. Those were always more attractive to me. So like, you can win a Civic, and like, that's awesome. But like, and of course, they would never give away like a Ferrari. So about the greatest thing you could possibly hope for would be something like this. Here's a Nissan 300ZX 1988. Do you remember how awesome that was? That was the pinnacle of awesome. That was going to change your life forever. You want to know what it's worth now? I can't tell you. I tried to look it up on Kelley Blue Book. It only went back to 1992. So like, I really don't even know. But like, if you Google it, like, mostly what you find are parts. You can order a bunch of parts for it. But I did find one actually that was available on Craigslist. Here's an 88, and that's what it looks like right now. If you can see that, it's hopefully bigger on the screen behind me. But it's not that awesome now, is it? Like, it's actually interesting. I don't know how much you can read, but I tried to highlight this guy. Like, really, what he's trying to do is just get rid of it. Like, it's taking up space. This is the thing that we all would have like died to try and get. And now he's just trying to get rid of, like, he wants to trade this for the air that is displacing on his property. And when I found this, it had been up for 15 days, so no one he couldn't find anyone interested. Literally, to trade, this is Jesus giving you the flash forward of your earthly treasures as just incredibly poor short-term investments. This is whatever it is that you love or think is awesome or kind of lusting after. This is what it's going to look like. It's going to break, bust, rust, go obsolete, wear out. Just very, very, very poor short-term investment. Now, I know some of you are here and you're like, okay, well, that's why I'm obviously not investing in like Nissans. Like, I'm making good, strong long-term investments. And like, I hope you are. But the fact is, we're still really not really thinking all that much about the future. In serious, like, it's the cliche, but it's because it's true. Like, what are the guarantees in life? Are taxes going to take some of your money? Okay, death is going to take whatever's left. So maybe you've read about money or investing, or you listen to Dave Ramsey on the radio. You know what? Like, we listen to Dave Ramsey sometimes, or podcasts. We do, and like, that's a really wise thing to do in a lot of ways, right? Why is that? Why is that a wise thing to do? To listen to Dave Ramsey on the radio is because of course it's wise to listen to somebody who's been further down the path that you're on or that you're hoping to be on, and he's encountered some obstacles and he's seen how things work, and so he can look back and he can offer some real help and some real wisdom. So that really makes sense. And like, this isn't certainly going to be anti-Dave. We like Dave Ramsey. We may at some point like teach his material in a class sometime here. So none of this is going to be against that. But do you ever strike you that there's never been like an investing book written from the perspective of someone who's like not just a few steps further down the path, but from someone who's gone like all the way down the path? Like there's no radio show or podcast from someone telling you like how you really might best manage your money from the perspective of like once your life ends. Like nobody has come back from heaven and said this is what to do with your money, with kind of one exception, a little bit. Here's from Jesus in Luke 12. And he says, this is Jesus, okay, who of course comes from eternity past. It says he told them a story. A rich man had a fertile farm that produced fine crops. It's a great start. Rich, fertile farm, good crops, everything good. And he said to himself, listen, you got to pay attention to the point Jesus is making, but if you can do that and also just be entertained by the way this guy talks to himself, it's fantastic. Like, this is my favorite, like, fictitious Jesus character of the entire Bible. It really is. It's just amazing. I love the way, so he says, what should I do? I don't have room for all my crops. Problem. Lots of crops, not enough space for them. So then he said, I know. I think he raised his finger like that. He said, I know. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. Problem. Solution. Not enough space for my crops. Going to get some more space for my crops. He says, then I'll have room enough to store all my wheat and other goods. And I'll sit back and say to myself, this is my favorite right here, my friend. He's talking to himself. He calls himself my friend. That just cracks me up. I guess it's just me, but that's all right. It cracks me up. He says, my friend, you have enough stored away for years to come. Now take it easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. It's a great success. Like, this is exactly what we're all working for, right? This is like, because we see somebody as financially successful through our human eyes, right? What? Like, if they have enough to arrive comfortably at death. You maybe wouldn't say it like that, but that's really exactly what we're looking for, right? That's what we all admire. That's what we're all jealous of. It's what we're all working for. And so that's how we see with our human eyes, but of course Jesus comes to offer you some God goggles. It says, God said to him, you fool, you'll die this very night. Like, then who will get everything you work for? You're going to die this very night. Like, I hope none of us. But there's going to be some night. And so Jesus offers this eternal perspective. It's like this whole goal of just like arriving comfortably at death, this is really tremendously short-sighted. That's just a really, really poor goal. Like through some God goggles, how foolish maybe do some of us kind of look or will kind of feel if we really let what Jesus has to say here in to consider the way that we've been acting. You know, like, honestly, taking financial advice from a rich living human being isn't all that different from like the way we'd have seen Mike Tieszen when he was making hundreds of millions of dollars. Like, they look awesome at the moment, of course, but it's just a matter of time. Like, my bank account and your bank account and Mike Tieszen and Dave Ramsey and Elon Musk and the homeless guy down the street, we're all going to be at exactly the same balance soon enough. So, goodness, what do we do? Like, is this kind of a hopeless situation? Like, Jesus is saying all your earthly treasures, like, they're gonna rust and go obsolete, and you're gonna be like posting on Craigslist for someone to just take it away, and then the build bigger barns guy, Like God's like, well, you really you're just pretty foolish. Like, is there any hope for us? Is there any sort of better alternative? Well, let's go back to where Jesus started a minute ago. See what he has. He says, okay, here we are again. Don't store up treasures here on earth where moths eat them and rust destroys them and where thieves break in and steal. Like, okay, but what is there a better option? What can I do? So, yeah, store your treasures in heaven. Like, we can do that? Like, can we actually do that? Like, heaven, where moths and rust cannot destroy, yeah, that's better. Okay, where thieves do not break in and steal, well, that's way better. Like, wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will be also. Jesus, with the eternal perspective, says, guys, you're kind of making terrible investments, and you're really not thinking enough about the future. And one way I've seen this sort of paraphrased or condensed that I think is kind of brilliant and very helpful is that you can't take it with you, which we all know. Okay? But you can store your treasure in heaven. You can send it on ahead. Okay? Because we're going to lose every last penny, you guys. Every one of true, right? I think we all know this. We all agree with this. But Jesus points to the idea that there is another option. You can store your treasure actually in heaven rather than on earth. And that's a good investment that does properly consider the future. There's a well-known missionary who died young for the sake of the gospel, and he's known for brilliantly saying this line. He says that he's no fool. Like we saw, God calls the build bigger barns guy a fool. He says he's no fool who gives up what he can't keep, right? Which is everything we have. What? To gain what he can't lose. Like, how much sense does that make? Like, how is, like, through some God goggles, that's just really almost kind of like simple and obvious, isn't it? Like, it's kind of sheer madness if we don't do that. You can't take it with you, but you can send it on ahead. Like, store your treasures in heaven. You're no fool to give up what you can't keep, to gain what you can't lose. And so I was thinking this week as I was preparing this message, I'm like, why don't we do this? Like, why is this so difficult for us? Right? Because I sat where you sit. I live in the same world you do. I have honestly the same heart that probably most of you do. It's like, this is really hard. Like, we push back on this, we get defensive, and like it's incredibly difficult. And there's, like, for one, like, some of us maybe here today, you're not even really sure about the whole like Jesus or God or heaven or afterlife thing. Like, even you kind of have to admit, right, that like we're going to die and we're not going to take it with us. We understand that much. We even agree on that much. But like, maybe you're not, like, so some of us, maybe we just don't believe it. Others of us, like, probably we've all heard pastors or churches or theologies that kind of manipulate this or kind of twist it into something that, like, God never really intended. And so that's gross and that's ugly. But Jesus sure doesn't do that, right? He just lays this out as, like, kind of common sense. So, like, there's really nothing that Jesus says that you'd want to push back on. And so then I think, like, you know, really what it is I think it's just the way that our human eyes see. Right? Because our minds are all smart enough to understand this. Like, you all knew kind of everything that I said before you came in. None of you are really that impressed with my super amazing insight that an 88 Nissan isn't that cool anymore. Like, yes, Ross, like, we know. You guys all saw that coming before I even pointed it out, right? Because you're smart people. You understand that. But our eyes can't see. And so we end up following what our eyes see. That's actually why I showed you the picture of the car, right? We follow what our eyes see rather than what our minds know to be true, which actually led me to this pretty amazing couple of verses in the first part of Colossians 3. It says, so since you've been raised to new life with Christ, so clearly this is written to people who are following Jesus. Look at this. He says, set your sights, right? Look at what? The realities around us? No, it says the realities of heaven, where Christ sits at the place of honor at God's right hand. And then that leads to, so think about what? Well, the things of heaven, right? Not the things of earth. Not the things of earth. It's so hard to see the things of heaven, right? Because obviously it's just invisible to our eyes. There's this terrible dynamic that we all have to live with in this life where the only things our eyes can see are the things that are physical and that are around us, right? But we also know, our minds understand that the physical things around us are passing and they're temporary. They're really not permanent or real compared to the things of eternity and heaven. But the really eternal, permanent things are literally invisible to our eyes. And so what do we think about? Is obviously what we see. It's what we're looking at. If you're looking at your 401k, you're going to be thinking about your 401k. This is just the way our minds work, right? So you guys, this is why you gotta have goggles. Because your human eyes just aren't going to see the realities. It's the realities of heaven. But when you do, when you look at the realities of heaven, then what are you going to do? You're going to think about the things of heaven. And when you see as God sees, you will do as God says. Like, you will be delighted to do as God says. Because it just makes sense, and it's so for your good. Like, this isn't God like trying to take your money because he needs it. This is pretty clearly, when you hear the words of Jesus, right? Like, this is for you. And I will bet that for every one of us here in this room or watching online, if you're still watching online, God bless you. But yeah, I know it's harder to get up and leave if you're sitting here. When does the message on money? You can do it, but maybe you don't want to make that statement. So don't worry, I can't even see you. But in all seriousness, like, I'll bet for every one of us here watching or listening or whatever it is, I will bet that your level of giving matches very, very closely to the level of how much time you spend thinking about the earthly things that are in front of us that we see versus how much time we spend thinking about the realities of heaven. I'll bet that's true for you, isn't it? I'll bet it is. So, I hope this isn't something that I end up talking about a lot. I do not intend it to be. I hope this is the last time I mention it for a long time. But it seems to be helpful today, so I'll talk about it today. I've mentioned a couple times that a little under 2 years ago, I was suddenly and very shockingly diagnosed with colon cancer. And there was a time, I don't remember how long, the whole thing's a blur, but at least a couple weeks or something, I don't know, where we had just no information on really what that was going to mean. And colon cancer can be anywhere on the whole spectrum, from you catch it early, very, very treatable, even curable, to it's oftentimes fatal. I had actually a person in my life who just a couple years prior to that, who was just about my age, who had died of colon cancer. So it could be literally anywhere on that, and we just didn't know. Like, we just didn't know. And one of the interesting things that happens is when you're living in an experience like that for a little bit, you kind of see things a little differently, right? And I wouldn't certainly, like, I wouldn't wish on anybody, like, to go through the process of what it all means. But that couple weeks, like, you almost kind of feel like God gives you some goggles for a little bit. And you really see things through a different lens. And so, Laura and I have never been what, by North American standards, people would consider wealthy. Like, certainly every one of us is wealthy by world standards, for sure, but that's for another day. But we've never been what people would consider wealthy, but we did, do some planning. And, we'd been putting some into retirement accounts because, honestly, I think it's wise, right? Like, the Bible has a lot of good things to say about being wise and planning and looking ahead to the future. And you don't want to, be like a burden or a responsibility for somebody else when, you have the power and the ability to take care of yourself, all of these things. And so, we'd been doing some things for, looking to retirement or whatever, although, of course, we're still dashingly young. But one of the things, if you've ever taken any steps down that path, is it can be very easy for it to start to take up, like, larger and larger pieces of your mind. And sometimes it can even very, very easily, you'll tell yourself it's not happening, but even kind of creep down into your heart a little bit. And it's so fun when the numbers go up, right? And you feel like you're winning, like, hey, this is going well, this is really great. And it's not a bad goal, it's not ungodly. But listen, all of that, even, let me tell you, this is even in the context from when I was a very young child. My parents taught me to always give back to God 10% of whatever came my way. And so I'd been doing that basically my whole life. We'd been doing that for our entire marriage. So it wasn't even in the context of like we'd been just like, ravenously consuming or hoarding everything that we had. But man, I'll tell you still, there were some moments where I thought a little bit about all the emotional investment and all the effort that we put in into watching those numbers go up. And man, it felt really dumb. Just really rock stupid. And so here's the good news and here's the bad news. The good news is I'm cured. Like I'm at 45 here, I'm healthier than probably most 45-year-olds. Like everything's fine, everything's great. The bad news is, man, let me tell you that as soon as the doctors had me convinced that at some point, right, like after a process, that I was going to be able to go back to what we would consider like a normal life, like I have today, like just everything you want, it's so easy to just tear those goggles right off. Like, okay, that was close. We were nervous for a little bit, but I'm not going to die. Like, what? Like you can really make yourself believe that, right? Like just because I don't have cancer right at the moment, that like now did I like magically become immortal? Am I like this is and then this incredible danger of what utter heights of foolishness would this be to like go through a couple of years of that and then not learn what God's trying to teach me? Like that's terrible. And so here's the opposite of that sort of a double foolishness is what I'd love for you guys. Is if you could be able to really grab hold of some of those goggles without even having to go through the experience. That seems like that would be the height of wisdom, wouldn't it? Because you guys, every one of us can be the build bigger barns guy in the parable or the ex-pro athlete who goes broke. Our lives are short. The guarantee is that we don't make it out alive. And you don't want to make poor investments or not think about the future. You can't take it with you, but you can send it on ahead. Store your treasures in heaven. And so here's what I want for you guys today is to take a step that you're going to be so glad you did. And listen, I know sometimes these messages can sound super self-serving or manipulative or like, well, what's it, like, does the church need money? So you know what? You know what I want is I want to be a church where we do what's good for the church is what's good for you. And the moment that what we tell you to do isn't what's good for you, then that's the moment that we become a really stupid church. So if you're like, I don't really feel like I want to give to the church that talks about money like this, because man, I don't know that, like he's barely even been here a couple months now, like we don't even trust him yet, and he's coming in telling us all this. Like I don't think that's the kind of ministry that I would want to give to. Awesome. Give somewhere else. Here are some examples. Just this was not hard to come up with. There are so many places. Never Thirst is an organization that gives that provides water and Jesus to people who have neither. Awesome. Give to them. The Christian Alliance for Orphans, exactly what it sounds like. Does that seem like a great place to send some ahead and put some treasure in heaven and be a part of an incredible blessing to people on earth? Absolutely. Compassion International and World Help, those are just a couple of what we think of as like child sponsorship organizations. You guys, if you want, take out your camera, take a picture of this, go home, look them up. These are all like well-known, respected, accountable organizations that are meeting people's physical and spiritual needs that I would like to think anyone would love to be a part of and represent fantastic ways to store some treasure in heaven and give some ahead. I always think the local church is the great first spot for giving, but if you're like, yeah, I don't know, then I didn't like the way this came out. Awesome. Like, don't spite yourself because you didn't like the way something was presented. Listen to Jesus. You can't take it with you, but you can send it on ahead. He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. Store your treasures in heaven. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much that through Jesus in Scripture, you make these things so stark, so clear, that you deal with reality that we all know that we're living in for a little while. Still praying, if you're here today and man, all you've just heard about is money, but you just can't help thinking that there's more to, there's more to life than, there's more to life than money. And you're thinking about where you're spending eternity, and probably, this wasn't like a come to Jesus for forgiveness message, but man, that's what you need. Like, forget about money. You're worried about where you're going to be for eternity. You should be, listen, but you don't need to be. This is your moment. It's so simple. Every one of us has sinned. There were things we knew they were wrong. We did them anyway. That destroys any chance we can have of a relationship with a perfectly holy and just God. But that's why Jesus Christ came, not just to help us with our earthly treasures, but to come and live and die and be resurrected so you could be forgiven and have a restored relationship with God and be adopted into his family for eternity. Listen, if that's you right where you sit, even silently, just say to God and he'll hear you pray, God, I believe that Jesus Christ came and died and rose again so that I could be forgiven and adopted as a child in your family. Please come into my life. Forgive me and adopt me. Begin to make me into the person you created me to be. And give me the life that you have for me. If you just prayed a prayer like that for the first time, it's not the words or the prayer that saves you, it's just that you put your faith in Jesus, and he will respond to that. You're a new spiritual creation, forgiven and adopted as a child in his family. Will you please stop at the point on the way out, or put something on the website in the Next Steps launcher, or email me. I'm ross@lifepointcrossing.com, or grab me in the lobby. Someone talk to the friend who brought you if that's your situation, so that we can follow up and have some communication and get you taking some positive, healthy steps in your new life with Jesus. We are so excited about what God is doing in your life. You are worth so much more than any ridiculous earthly treasures that we actually just spent the 30 minutes talking about here today. For the rest of us, I know this is one of those things you can say at any time, at any spot, and you could always feel like, oh, we could be giving more, should we be giving more? And they're not really easy answers on that. But listen, will you, if you're married or in a committed relationship, will you commit right now just to go home and have a conversation about what you want to do with your earthly treasures? If you're here, maybe you're single, or maybe you just know that like whoever it is, they're going to listen to you anyway. Will you make that commitment between you and the Spirit of God that you're going to take a step to store your treasures in heaven? Like, it's really the only sensible thing to do right now between you and the Spirit of God. Make that commitment. Have the conversation, whatever it is for you. Father, we're so grateful that you do give us the way forward, that you do take what could appear to be a hopeless situation of what do we do living our whole lives for just nothing, and then we die, and you make that into a way that we can invest for eternity. Father, we are so grateful for all that you do for us and provide for us. We love you, we praise you, we thank you. Our entire lives are yours for your glory in the name of Jesus Christ.